let's turn to Lori Peak. She's the director of the Natural Hazards Center and a sociology professor at the University of Colorado Boulder. Welcome to the show. First of all, Edis was talking about accountability. It's been a lot of reporting calling into question the early warning systems in place and also looking into DOGE and these federal funding cuts, which also perhaps contributed to the tragedy. Do you see connective tissue there? What is the case when it comes to this Texas flooding, do you think?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me on to talk about this difficult topic. So regarding the early warning systems, this has really been a challenge that's stretched back decades with the most affected county there. Kirk County had obviously been trying to make progress with getting a flood warning system given their extreme risk, but had not been successful at getting that into place. And so I think you're absolutely right that right now with the additional funding cuts that are happening at the federal level for emergency preparedness and response actions will undoubtedly affect future opportunities in Texas as well as in many other communities across the nation who are seeking to get these life-saving warning systems.
And Texas is not a poor state. In fact, it's received more federal disaster relief funding than any other state, yet it seems so ill-equipped to deal with disasters. I mean, the state buckled from the effects of the winter storm back in 2021, hundreds of deaths as a result of widespread power outages then. What are we seeing in that state? Why is it having such difficulty when it comes to these disasters, do you think?
Well, first, I just do want to say that Texas actually has an incredibly robust emergency management infrastructure. They have one of the most seasoned emergency management teams and really seasoned leadership within the state of Texas. But they have indeed, as you suggest, been incredibly challenged by everything from Winter Storm Uri, as you just referred to, as well as these recent floods and many other disasters. And so you are correct that Texas does receive a lot of federal funds for disaster response. And some of that has to do with Texas is one of our most populated states in the nation, and it's also one of our most disaster prone. And so a lot of funding has come into the state of Texas in order to support disaster recovery in particular. But these disasters are coming so fast and so furious that if most of those dollars end up getting dedicated to emergency response, that doesn't leave a lot of dollars left behind to dedicate to emergency preparedness and mitigation, which is exactly where we need those additional dollars to go.
Well, Lori, I think, with climate change, it seems like we see disasters just increasing in its magnitude everywhere, not just in this country, but around the world. And now we're talking about FEMA actually reducing its capacity to actually respond. Give us what kind of a scenario we're looking at, do you think?
Yeah, so, and you're right again that climate change is obviously driving some of what we're seeing with rising disaster losses across the US, but also globally. But some of this is also being driven by increased population and including more people living in more hazard-prone places, decaying infrastructure, and other factors that are leading to this increase in disaster losses in our country as well as, again, globally. But as you note, as we're concurrently seeing this rise in disaster losses, right now we're also seeing what appears to be a diminished disaster funding ecosystem for exactly what we need, which is emergency preparedness and response, as well as recovery and mitigation. So we need funding across the life cycle of communities are going to ready themselves for these disasters and also be able to effectively recover when disaster does strike. And so right now, I think that calculation of more disasters but less disaster funding, something's going to give here. And I think that if anything can come out of this terrible tragedy of these Texas floods, I hope it can be more focus on what is really needed to help communities to truly ready themselves for not just the last disaster, but also the disasters that are to come in the future.
Lori, when you were talking about that and funding, your hands were going out, but here in Washington, it's kind of an accordion. They're going in. I mean, you hear a lot of people here in Washington saying, no, we've got to shift the burden back to the states. And North Carolina Governor Josh Stein says That shift just doesn't make any sense. States don't suffer huge storms every year, but the country does. So it doesn't make sense for each state to have their own fully staffed emergency response team. Clearly, that would cost a lot of money when the federal government's a much better a way of doing this. Does he have a point?
Yeah, so I mean, for a long time, FEMA's motto has definitely been that disaster response and recovery should be locally led, state managed, and then supported at the federal level. But the support that the federal government was providing, it was indeed funding, but it was also expertise that many of our federal agencies, including the Federal Emergency Management Agency, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and many other agencies, they're staffed by some of our nation's leading experts in disaster preparedness, response, recovery. And so it's both the funding that can come from the federal government, but it's also that expertise, the training, the support that can help to ensure that locals are ready to lead their own disaster response and states are ready to manage it. And so I think right now, what's happening with the sort of moving things to the state and local government, we were already really trying to set up a system where, again, that disaster response would be locally led and managed at the state level. But if that federal funding is cut, that's obviously a vital lifeline that communities across the nation are relying on in the case of disaster, but also to reduce future disaster risk. And so I think that's a conversation that still needs to be ongoing, and final decisions haven't been made around this. And so I think there is still time to intervene and to, rather than do away with some of these vital federal agencies, perhaps to take actions to strengthen them to ensure that those local, state, and federal connections are strong.